Let me set the stage for you. My name is Linda, and I'm 50 years old. For the better part of my life, over 25 years, I was married to the love of my life, or so I thought. His name is Mark. To anyone looking from the outside, we were the epitome of a rock-solid couple. Two people who had weathered the storm of life together. We weren't perfect, no one is, but our bond was real. At least, I believed it was. Mark was your everyday guy. Down-to-earth, hard-working, the type of man you'd see chatting with the neighbors as he mowed the lawn or fixing something in the garage on a sunny Saturday. Nothing about him screamed wild card. If anything, he was dependable to a fault, a comforting constant in my life. And me? I liked to think I brought the spark to our partnership, the balance that kept us thriving for over 2 decades. We raised 2 wonderful kids together and were blessed with 2 precious grandkids. Our home was always filled with laughter, love, and that warm sense of belonging you get after years of building a life with someone. People often said, "You two are #couple goals," and I'd laugh, thinking how we'd managed to keep the spark alive. But life, as I've come to learn, has a cruel way of turning the tables on you when you least expect it. Little did I know that behind Mark's steady and familiar presence lay secrets that would shatter the very foundation of my world. Looking back, the signs were there long before I realized it. Subtle changes that I brushed off as part of the natural ebb and flow of a marriage. Mark began staying late at work more often, an occasional late night turned into a weekly habit. He had always been meticulous, even a bit obsessive about keeping a schedule, but lately, there was an air of unpredictability to him. At first, I chalked it up to stress. Mark was a project manager at a construction firm, and deadlines had always weighed on him heavily. I even felt a pang of guilt for not being more understanding, thinking I wasn't doing enough to support him. So, when he came home late, I'd have his favorite lasagna waiting, or I'd pour him a glass of wine and listen to him vent. But the little things started to add up. The way he seemed distracted, like he was present, but not really there. He stopped asking about my day or laughing at my corny jokes, something he used to love. Worst of all, the affection that once came so naturally, the random kisses on my forehead, the way he'd always hold my hand during movie nights, had disappeared. It was as though he had switched to autopilot, and I was the passenger, no longer part of his route. Then there was the phone. Support the channel by subscribing, it really helps. It had become almost glued to his hand. Whenever I walked into the room, he'd lock the screen and place it face down on the table. He'd never been secretive about his phone before. I shrugged it off at first, thinking maybe he was planning a surprise for our anniversary or keeping work stuff private. But the gnawing feeling in my gut told me otherwise. One evening, as we sat together in silence, I decided to ask him outright, "Mark, is everything okay? You've been different lately." He didn't even look up from his plate as he muttered, "I'm fine. Work's just been hectic." "Are you sure? I feel like we're not connecting the way we used to," I pressed, my voice faltering. He sighed, the kind of sigh that told me he didn't want to have this conversation. "Linda, you're overthinking. Everything's fine." But everything wasn't fine. A few days later, I found a scarf in his car, one I didn't recognize. It was a bold, bright red, something completely unlike my style. When I asked him about it, he shrugged and said it probably belonged to a coworker who hitched a ride. It felt like a reasonable explanation, but a small part of me couldn't shake the unease. And then, there was my nephew, Jake. At 25, he was the charismatic, golden child of my side of the family. He had moved to the city recently for work, and we'd welcomed him with open arms. Mark always seemed to take a special interest in Jake, mentoring him, inviting him over for barbecues. It warmed my heart to see Mark so involved in helping him navigate adulthood. But then, something changed in their dynamic. They started spending more time together, weekend trips I wasn't invited on, late-night beers in the garage while I went to bed alone. At the time, I thought Mark was just being the supportive uncle figure Jake needed. Little did I know, those late nights and weekends would become the unraveling of everything I thought I knew about my husband. Mark always had a knack for taking people under his wing, and Jake was no exception. I remember how excited he was to teach Jake to drive when my nephew first moved to town. "Linda, the kid's got no idea what he's doing behind the wheel," he'd chuckle, shaking his head. "I can't let him loose on the roads like that." Mark offered to teach Jake as a way to help him settle in, and I thought it was sweet. Jake didn't grow up with much guidance. His dad had been absent most of his life, and my sister was doing her best as a single mom. So, Mark stepped in with the kind of fatherly energy Jake probably hadn't felt in years. The lesson started small. Mark would take Jake to the empty lot at the local high school on weekends. They'd spend hours practicing parking, turns, and highway merging. I remember standing on the porch as they pulled into the driveway after one of their sessions. Jake was beaming, and Mark had that proud, satisfied look I hadn't seen in a long time. "Linda, you wouldn't believe it," Mark said as he walked inside, grinning from ear to ear. "The kid's finally stopped slamming the brakes like he's trying to put a hole in the road." Jake added, "Uncle Mark's the best. He doesn't yell at me like those driving instructors do." It warmed my heart to see them so close. I even joked to Mark one night, "You're spoiling him, you know. He's going to think you're better than his own parents." Mark just smiled and said, "Well, maybe he needs that right now." A few weeks later, they started going fishing together. Mark had always loved fishing, and Jake picked it up as quickly as anything else. They'd wake up early on Sunday mornings, pack a cooler with sandwiches and sodas, and head to the lake. I didn't mind. Honestly, it was nice to have some quiet time at home. When they'd come back, they'd both smell like bait and river water, laughing about the one that got away. "Linda, I swear, he's got a knack for it," Mark would say, holding up a picture on his phone of Jake grinning with his catch of the day. But as time went on, those fishing trips started to feel excessive. At first, they'd head out once or twice a month, but then it was every weekend. If I made plans for the two of us, Mark would suddenly remember a fishing date with Jake. "Can we reschedule?" "I promised him already," he'd say, kissing my forehead like it was no big deal. I didn't think much of it at the time. Why would I? They were bonding. My husband was being the supportive role model Jake needed. But looking back, I should have known something was off. One Sunday, when Mark and Jake came back from the lake, I noticed Jake wearing Mark's jacket. It was one of Mark's favorites, a vintage leather piece he barely let me borrow, let alone anyone else. "He was cold," Mark said when I asked about it. "What's the big deal?" Jake chimed in, laughing. "Uncle Mark saved me from freezing out there. He's the best." I smiled, but the unease crept in again. Something about the way Jake said it felt strange. Too familiar. The next weekend, I woke up to find Mark already gone. No coffee brewing, no goodbye kiss, just a note on the counter, "Fishing with Jake. Don't wait up." It stung, but I pushed the feeling aside. After all, what kind of person questions their husband spending time with family? But little did I know, those seemingly innocent outings were more than fishing trips. They were rehearsals for a betrayal I couldn't have imagined in my darkest nightmares. It wasn't like me to doubt Mark. For more than 25 years, I had trusted this man with my heart and my life. But something in the way he acted around Jake started to nag at me, like a thread pulling loose from the fabric of my reality. The fishing trips and driving lessons were one thing, but soon it seemed like Jake had become a permanent fixture in Mark's world. He'd stop by unannounced at odd hours, always with some casual excuse. "Just picking up that wrench Uncle Mark promised me," or "needed help with my resume." And Mark? He'd drop whatever he was doing, as if Jake's needs were the most urgent thing on earth. At first, I found it endearing. After all, Mark had always been the kind of guy who couldn't say no to family. But over time, their bond began to feel exclusive. One Saturday evening, I was setting the table for dinner when Mark announced he'd invited Jake to join us. "Hope you made extra," he said, flashing that easy grin of his. I hadn't. It wasn't like Jake to come over for dinner, but I didn't mind making space for him. When he arrived, though, it wasn't the usual lively Jake I was used to. He seemed nervous, fidgeting with his napkin and avoiding eye contact. Mark, on the other hand, was all smiles, cracking jokes and nudging Jake to lighten up. At one point, Jake spilled his glass of water, and Mark was quick to jump up and clean it up, brushing off my attempts to help. "I got this, Linda. Don't worry about it." It was a small thing, but something about the way Mark hovered over Jake made my stomach twist. Why was he being so attentive? Almost protective? Later that night, I brought it up while we were doing the dishes. Support the channel by subscribing, it really helps. "You've been spending a lot of time with Jake lately," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Yeah, he needs guidance," Mark replied without looking up. "I don't think his dad was ever there for him, you know? I want to make sure he's on the right path." "I get that," I said. "But don't you think you're going a bit overboard? He's a grown man now." Mark paused, his hands still submerged in the soapy water. "He's family, Linda. What's the big deal?" "It's not a big deal," I said quickly. "It's just, I feel like you've been more focused on him than on us lately." Mark turned to face me, his brow furrowed. "Are you seriously jealous of Jake?" The accusation stung. "Of course not. I just—" "Then drop it," he interrupted, his voice firm. "I'm trying to be a good uncle. That's all." I nodded, biting my tongue, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. A few weeks later, things escalated. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, and I decided to surprise Mark at the garage where he kept his tools. He'd mentioned working on a project for Jake, a new tackle box for their fishing trips, and I thought I'd bring him some coffee. When I opened the garage door, I froze. Mark and Jake were huddled close together, speaking in low voices. Jake was holding the handle of the tackle box, but Mark's hand lingered over his for just a moment too long. Their heads snapped up when they saw me, and they both stepped apart quickly, like kids caught sneaking cookies before dinner. "Linda," Mark said, his voice too bright. "Didn't expect you out here." "I brought coffee," I said, my tone neutral, though my heart was racing. "Thanks," he said, taking the mug from me and glancing nervously at Jake. Jake muttered something about needing to head home and slipped out, barely looking at me as he passed. When the door closed behind him, I turned to Mark. "What was that about?" "What do you mean?" he asked, feigning confusion. "That," I said, gesturing to where Jake had been standing. "You both looked like I caught you robbing a bank." Mark chuckled, but it sounded forced. "Don't be ridiculous. We were just talking about fishing gear." Fishing gear. It was always about fishing gear. But in that moment, I knew something was off. I didn't have the proof, not yet, but my gut was screaming at me that this wasn't just about being a good uncle. Still, I pushed the thought away. After all, Mark had been my rock for 25 years. Could I really believe he was capable of something so unthinkable? It was a chilly Friday evening, and Mark had texted me to say he'd be late. He claimed he had to stay back at work to finish a bid proposal for a new project. That wasn't unusual, but something about the way the message came in, short, curt, no usual love you or even a kiss emoji, made me uneasy. I decided to stay up and wait for him. I brewed a pot of tea and curled up on the couch with an old photo album, flipping through pictures of our kids when they were little. There were so many happy memories, vacations, holidays, moments where Mark and I looked like the perfect team. But as the hours ticked by and the clock struck midnight, the warmth of nostalgia gave way to a cold, sinking feeling in my chest. By 1 a.m., I gave up waiting. I crawled into bed, telling myself I was being paranoid. After all, Mark had never given me a concrete reason to doubt him. But sleep didn't come. It was around 3 a.m. when I heard the faint sound of the garage door opening. My heart jumped. I stayed in bed, pretending to be asleep as I listened to Mark's heavy footsteps make their way inside. The next morning, I casually asked him how work went. "Oh, it was fine," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Just a long night." "What time did you get home?" I asked. "Around midnight," he replied, sipping his coffee. I stared at him, my heart sinking. Midnight? I'd heard the garage door at 3 a.m. But why would he lie? "Linda, why are you looking at me like that?" Mark asked, his voice sharp. "Just tired," I mumbled, not wanting to start a fight. But the doubt gnawed at me. The real breaking point came 2 weeks later. Mark and Jake had planned another fishing trip. By now, I wasn't even pretending to like how much time they were spending together, but I didn't say anything. I just smiled tightly and waved them off. But as I was folding laundry later that day, I noticed something strange. Mark had left his gym bag in the corner of our bedroom unzipped. Usually, he was meticulous about keeping his things tidy. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened it. Inside, I found clothes, toiletries, and a small bottle of cologne I didn't recognize. It wasn't the earthy, understated scent Mark usually wore. This was something different, sweet and bold, the kind you'd expect from someone younger. Someone like Jake. My chest tightened. I couldn't bring myself to confront him outright, so I decided to do something I never thought I'd do. I followed them. I waited until the next fishing trip the following weekend. Mark left early as usual, with Jake riding shotgun in his truck. I gave them a half-hour head start before grabbing my keys and heading out. At first, everything seemed normal. I spotted Mark's truck parked near the lake where they usually fished. I stayed at a distance, watching as they unloaded their gear. Mark carried the cooler while Jake followed with the rods, laughing at something Mark had said. It looked so ordinary. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe my suspicions were just the product of an overactive imagination. But then, they didn't go toward the pier like they always did. Instead, they veered off toward the woods, taking a narrow trail I hadn't noticed before. I parked my car and quietly followed on foot, careful to stay far enough behind so they wouldn't see me. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure they'd hear it. The trail led to a small, secluded clearing near the water. And that's when I saw it. Jake was sitting on a fallen log, his hand resting on Mark's knee. They were laughing, but there was an intimacy in their body language that I couldn't ignore. Mark leaned in closer, his hand brushing Jake's shoulder. It felt like the world stopped spinning. My breath caught in my throat, and I stood frozen, unable to move. And then, Mark leaned even closer, whispering something into Jake's ear. Jake laughed, his cheeks flushing, and nudged Mark playfully. I couldn't watch anymore. My legs felt like lead as I stumbled back toward my car, tears streaming down my face. This wasn't just fishing. This wasn't just a close bond between an uncle and nephew. Support the channel by subscribing, it really helps. This was something else entirely. The 2 days that followed my trip to the lake were a blur. I couldn't shake the image of Mark and Jake in that secluded clearing, the way they laughed, the closeness that didn't feel like mere family affection. I wanted to be wrong. I needed to be wrong. But every time I tried to tell myself I was imagining things, my mind dragged me back to the way Mark had been acting for months. The late nights. The lies. The subtle, but undeniable distance. And Jake, always there, as if he'd become the center of Mark's universe. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. And every time Mark looked at me, guilt twisted in my stomach. Why guilt? Because I still hadn't confronted him. I needed more proof, even though a part of me already knew the truth. Then came the second night. I had gone to bed early, hoping the quiet would still my racing thoughts. Mark had claimed he was working late again, though I'd stopped believing him long ago. I drifted into a restless sleep but woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. The house was too quiet. Mark wasn't in bed. I glanced at the clock, 2:14 a.m. My heart sank as I noticed the faint glow of light coming from under the door of our guest bedroom. Mark never used the guest room. Slowly, I got out of bed, my bare feet silent against the cool floor. As I approached the door, I heard muffled voices. Laughter. Jake's voice, followed by Mark's low chuckle. The pit in my stomach grew. My hand trembled as I reached for the doorknob, every instinct telling me to stop. But I couldn't. I had to know. I turned the knob and pushed the door open. And there they were. Mark and Jake, in my bed, the bed where I had folded laundry for years, where Mark and I had once shared quiet moments and secrets. They were tangled together under the covers, shirtless, their faces flushing with shock as they noticed me standing in the doorway. Time stopped. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I couldn't speak. What is this? I finally stammered, my voice shaking. Mark scrambled out of bed, grabbing a shirt from the floor, his face pale. Linda, it's not what it looks like, he started, his voice cracking with panic. But Jake didn't move. He just stared at me, wide-eyed, as if frozen in place. Not what it looks like? I repeated, my voice rising. Then tell me, Mark. Tell me what it is. There was no answer. Just silence. And that silence shattered something deep inside me. Get out, I whispered, my voice cold and trembling. Linda, please, Mark said, stepping toward me, his hands outstretched. I can explain. Get out. I screamed, cutting him off. My voice echoed through the house, raw and filled with the kind of pain I didn't know I was capable of feeling. Mark froze, and for a moment, I thought he might argue. But then he grabbed his clothes, his face crumpling with shame, and stumbled out of the room. Jake followed quickly, avoiding my gaze as he hurried past me. As the front door slammed shut behind them, I stood there, trembling, feeling like my entire world had been ripped away. I didn't cry. Not yet. I just stood in that doorway, staring at the empty bed, trying to comprehend the betrayal. This wasn't just about Mark cheating. It was about who he cheated with. My own nephew. Someone I had welcomed into my home, trusted, treated like my own child. The weight of it all hit me at once, and I sank to the floor, burying my face in my hands as the tears finally came. The life I had built for 25 years, the love I thought was unshakable, it was all gone. And I had no idea how I was going to survive what came next. The hours that followed were a blur. The house felt cavernous and empty, the silence almost deafening. I sat on the cold floor of the guest bedroom until the first light of dawn crept through the blinds. My mind replayed the scene over and over, Mark's stammered excuses, Jake's stunned expression, the bed that had once symbolized comfort now forever tainted. When I finally pulled myself together, I called my best friend, Susan. Linda? Her voice was groggy but concerned. Support the channel by subscribing, it really helps. It's 6 a.m. What's wrong? I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. A sob escaped instead. I'm coming over, she said without hesitation. By the time Susan arrived, I had managed to make myself a cup of tea, though I couldn't drink it. She walked through the door in her pajama pants and a hoodie, looking half asleep but fully ready to fight whoever had hurt me. Okay, spill, she said, sitting across from me at the kitchen table. The story tumbled out in broken pieces. I told her about Mark's late nights, the lake, the little signs I'd ignored. And finally, I told her about what I had walked in on just hours earlier. Oh my God, Susan whispered, her hand covering her mouth. Linda, I don't even know what to say. Your nephew? Jake? I nodded, tears streaming down my face. She reached across the table and grabbed my hands. You didn't deserve this. None of this is your fault. It was comforting to hear, but it didn't feel true. I couldn't stop questioning myself. Had I been too blind? Too trusting? Too wrapped up in the routines of our long marriage to see what was right in front of me? Mark tried calling later that morning. I stared at my phone as his name flashed across the screen, my stomach churning. He called again, then texted. Mark, Linda, please. I need to explain. It's not what you think. Mark, I love you. Please let me come home so we can talk. I deleted the messages without responding. What could he possibly say that would make any of this okay? Later that day, I had to face Jake. My sister, Carol, his mother, called me out of the blue. Jake said something happened last night, she said, her voice cautious. He's not making much sense, but he's upset. What's going on, Linda? My throat tightened. How could I explain this to her without shattering her, too? Jake was her pride and joy, the golden child she'd raised on her own. I can't get into it right now, I said, trying to steady my voice. But he crossed a line, Carol. A big one. What kind of line? She asked, her tone shifting to alarm. I hesitated, then said, ask him. He needs to tell you himself. Carol pushed for more, but I couldn't bring myself to say it. I wasn't ready to drop that kind of bomb on her. Not yet. That night, I found myself sitting in the living room, staring at an old family photo on the mantel. Mark, me, our kids, Jake, all smiling like we were the perfect family. It was a lie now. I packed a bag for Mark, stuffing it with clothes, toiletries, and whatever else I could fit. Then I left it on the porch, with a note taped to the top. Do not come inside. Do not call me. Do not text me. Speak to a lawyer. The next day, I met with an attorney. My hand shook as I signed the papers to begin divorce proceedings. 25 years of marriage, reduced to a stack of legal forms. Susan came with me for moral support. As I walked out of the attorney's office, she wrapped her arm around me and said, "You did the right thing, Linda. It's going to hurt, but you're stronger than you think." I wasn't sure I believed her. My heart was shattered, and my trust in the two people closest to me had been obliterated. But as I looked at the stack of papers in my hands, I felt the faintest glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could rebuild my life from the ashes of this betrayal. The days that followed were surreal. Every corner of the house seemed to echo with memories of Mark, his laughter during movie nights, the smell of his aftershave lingering in the bathroom. But now, those memories felt tainted, like a cruel joke played on me by the universe. I busied myself with tasks that required no thought. Cleaning, organizing, anything to keep from breaking down. Susan was a lifeline, stopping by daily with food, hugs, and words of encouragement. One step at a time, she'd remind me. You've already taken the hardest one by kicking him out. I wanted to believe her, but the silence at night was unbearable. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything over and over. How had I missed it? The signs were there, right? Or had I been so wrapped up in our comfortable routines that I'd ignored what was staring me in the face? A week later, my sister Carol showed up unannounced. She stood on the porch, arms crossed, her expression somewhere between concerned and furious. We need to talk, Linda. I froze. I knew this moment would come, but I wasn't ready. Still, I opened the door and motioned for her to come in. She wasted no time. Jake told me what happened, she said, her voice tight. I stared at her, searching for any hint of disbelief or denial. I can't believe with Mark, she continued, her voice breaking. How does this happen? He's your husband. Jake's his nephew, for God's sake. I nodded slowly, my throat too tight to speak. He's devastated, Carol added, sitting down at the kitchen table. He keeps saying it wasn't supposed to go this far, that it just happened. What does that even mean? My fists clenched. It means they knew what they were doing was wrong and did it anyway, I snapped, my voice sharper than I intended. Carol's face crumpled, and she put her head in her hands. I can't believe this. My son, how could he do this to you? To us? I softened, guilt washing over me. This wasn't just my pain, Carol had been blindsided, too. Jake wasn't just my nephew, he was her son, her pride and joy. I don't know, I admitted. but I can't fix it. And I can't forgive it. Not right now. The next bombshell came 2 days later. Support the channel by subscribing, it really helps. I was sitting in the living room, going through a stack of mail, when I got a message from an unfamiliar number. Unknown, Linda, please don't block me. It's Jake. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening. My instinct was to delete the message and move on, but something stopped me. Against my better judgment, I replied. Me, what do you want, Jake? His response came quickly. Jake, I need to explain. Please, can we talk? I hesitated, then typed, there's nothing you can say to make this better. He didn't reply right away, and I thought that was the end of it. But later that evening, my phone buzzed again. Jake, I need you to know it wasn't just me. Uncle Mark, he's the one who started it. I felt the air leave my lungs. Of course, I knew Mark was equally responsible, but seeing Jake put it into words hit me like a punch. Jake, he said he cared about me. That he loved me. I threw the phone down as tears blurred my vision. It didn't matter who started it, what mattered was that it had happened, and now my life was in ruins because of it. Susan found me later that night, curled up on the couch with a blanket pulled over my head. Hey, she said softly, sitting down beside me. Carol called. She told me what Jake said. I sniffled, but didn't reply. Linda, listen to me. Susan placed a hand on my shoulder. None of this is your fault. You didn't cause this. You didn't fail to see it. This is on them, and you have every right to be angry, to grieve. But you are not responsible for their choices. Her words broke something inside me, and I started sobbing. She pulled me into a tight hug, holding me like she could shield me from the pain. You're stronger than this, she whispered. You'll get through it. And when you do, you'll be better off without him. I wanted to believe her. I really did. The days after Jake's message were some of the hardest of my life. I felt like I was walking through quicksand, every step dragging me further down. But Susan's words stuck with me, you're stronger than this. Maybe she was right. Maybe I just needed to stop focusing on what I'd lost and start thinking about what came next. The first thing I did was pack away everything that reminded me of Mark. His clothes, his books, even the tools he loved so much. I shoved it all into boxes and dumped it in the garage. It felt petty at first, but with each item I removed from the house, it was like I was clearing space for myself to breathe again. I also canceled every shared account we had. Bank accounts, streaming services, even the joint email we'd used to sign up for home projects. Each cancellation felt like a small step toward reclaiming my life. But the biggest step came when I finally agreed to meet Jake. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when we sat down in a small coffee shop on the edge of town. I almost didn't recognize him, his confident, easygoing demeanor replaced with someone who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Thanks for meeting me, Jake said quietly, his hands wrapped around a coffee cup he hadn't touched. Don't thank me, I replied, my voice sharp. This isn't for you. It's for me. Jake nodded, swallowing hard. I don't even know where to start. How about with the truth? I said, folding my arms. You owe me that much. He hesitated, then began speaking. He told me how it started, how Mark had reached out to him shortly after he moved to the city, offering mentorship and support. At first, I thought he just cared about me, Jake said, his voice trembling. But then things got complicated. Complicated how? I pressed, my heart pounding in my chest. Jake looked down at his cup, unable to meet my gaze. He started saying things. That he understood me in a way no one else did. That he cared about me more than anyone ever had. I didn't know how to handle it. He was so convincing. I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. You're telling me he pursued you? Jake nodded, tears welling up in his eyes. I know it doesn't excuse what I did. I should have stopped it. I should have said no. But I didn't. And now I've hurt you, Aunt Linda. I've hurt our family. The weight of his words hit me like a ton of bricks. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him how much he'd destroyed. But looking at him, I saw someone just as broken as I was. Jake, I said, my voice trembling, you made a choice. Mark might have started it, but you let it happen. And now, I'm the one picking up the pieces of the life you two shattered. He nodded, tears streaming down his face. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm so sorry. After our conversation, I felt lighter. Not because I forgave Jake, I wasn't ready for that, but because I finally understood. Support the channel by subscribing, it really helps. It wasn't just about the betrayal anymore. It was about moving forward, even if it hurt. I blocked Jake's number after that meeting. I needed space from both of them, space to figure out who I was without the weight of their betrayal dragging me down. The next step in taking control was therapy. Susan had been pushing me to go since the beginning, and I finally caved. Sitting across from Dr. Patel, a kind-eyed woman in her 50s, I felt like I could finally start unpacking the mess in my head. Tell me about Mark, she said during our first session. I hesitated, then said, he was my everything. My partner, my rock. And now, he's just a stranger who broke me. And what about Jake? I clenched my fists. He was family. Someone I trusted. Someone I defended. And now, I don't even know if I can look at him again. Dr. Patel nodded, letting me vent without interruption. By the end of the session, I felt like I'd opened a door I hadn't even realized was locked. Little by little, I started to rebuild. I spent more time with my kids and grandkids, finding comfort in the family I still had. I joined a book club, something I'd always wanted to do, but never found time for. Most importantly, I started rediscovering who Linda was, outside of being Mark's wife. The months after Mark and Jake left my life were some of the hardest I've ever faced. I didn't just lose a husband, I lost my sense of stability, of knowing who I was in the world. Therapy helped, but healing wasn't a straight line. There were days I woke up feeling strong, ready to rebuild. And then there were nights when I'd sit alone in the dark, replaying their betrayal and wondering if I'd ever feel normal again. But slowly, the pieces started to come together. One turning point came about a year after the divorce papers were finalized. My daughter, Emily, insisted I join her on a weekend hiking trip. Mom, you need to get out of the house, she said, practically dragging me into the car. Fresh air, exercise, it's exactly what you need. At first, I balked. I hadn't been hiking in years, and the thought of being out in nature didn't appeal to me as much as curling up under a blanket with a book. But as we climbed that trail, surrounded by towering pines and the crisp mountain air, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, peace. Halfway up, Emily stopped and turned to me. You're smiling, she said, grinning back at me. I hadn't even realized it. I guess I am, I said, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I laughed. That trip sparked something in me. Over the next year, I threw myself into things I'd never made time for before. I joined a pottery class, took up gardening, and even started traveling with Susan, who declared it her mission to help me live my best postmark life. Paris, here we come, she'd exclaimed as we boarded a flight to France. Get ready to eat your weight in croissants, Linda. And I did. That trip, and the ones that followed, reminded me of something I'd lost during my marriage, me. As I rebuilt my life, I stayed determined not to let the past define me. I didn't talk about Mark or Jake much, even when people asked. My family knew the basics, but I kept the grittier details to myself. Why drag that pain into my new chapter? But the universe, as it turns out, had other plans. It was a sunny afternoon, almost 3 years to the day since I'd kicked Mark out. I was at the park with Emily and my grandson, watching him toddle around the playground. I'd brought a book to read while they played, but my attention kept drifting to the families around me, young parents chasing their kids, grandparents doting on their grandbabies. It was a bittersweet reminder of what I'd once had, but I pushed the thoughts away. This was my life now, and I was learning to embrace it. Then, as I glanced toward the picnic area, my heart stopped. There, sitting on a blanket in the shade, were Mark and Jake. They were laughing, sharing a bottle of wine, their bodies leaning casually toward each other. It was the kind of ease you only see between people who are completely comfortable together. Jake looked older, more mature, but Mark looked exactly the same. I froze, torn between wanting to flee and needing to confront them. But as I stood there, they didn't even notice me. They were too wrapped up in their little world, oblivious to the wreckage they'd left behind. Emily noticed my reaction. "Mom, are you okay?" she asked, following my gaze. When she saw them, her mouth tightened. Support the channel by subscribing, it really helps. Is that? Yes, I said quickly, grabbing her arm. Let's go. We left the park, my grandson blissfully unaware of the storm brewing inside me. That night, I sat in my kitchen, replaying the scene over and over. They were still together. After everything that had happened, they hadn't walked away from each other. Part of me felt anger, a white-hot fury at their audacity. But another part, one I hated to admit, felt something else. Relief. Because if they were still together, it meant something to them. It meant their betrayal wasn't just a fling or a phase. It didn't make it right, but it made it feel less senseless. I poured myself a glass of wine and stared out the window at the darkening sky. Mark and Jake had their lives, and I had mine. I'd built something strong, something good. And no matter what they had together, it couldn't take away the peace I'd worked so hard to find. That night, for the first time in years, I let it go. Support the channel by subscribing, it really helps.